Welcome to the OHA SDOH HB-5024 webinar for the 2022 Licensed Residential and Supportive Housing RFGA Award recipients. The purpose of today's webinar is to provide instructional information of the invoicing process for reimbursement of your housing development projects. In today's webinar, you will learn about the two types of invoicing, payment timelines, instructions on how to complete the invoice form, expenditure details, and the certification of authenticity. The detailed instructions will be included as part of this webinar for your easy reference, and we will also provide a step-by-step process of how to complete the invoicing form. So just a couple of things to remember, and I want to make sure that we go over, is that the monthly invoice forms will allow HB-5024 partners to submit reimbursement on a monthly basis in order to receive the HB-5024 funding for completed work on your projects. These reimbursements are set on a 45-day pay cycle. So you should be expected to receive reimbursement for submitting invoicing forms no later than 45 days after submitting. It's important to note that the initial monthly invoice form should be submitted prior to closing of the property. And this is only applicable in some situations if there is a real estate property purchase occurring. And you'll know if that will happen because we'll be in regular communication with you. It will also be very important if you have a real estate closing that you provide us at least 30 to 45-day advance notice prior to closing, because we have to coordinate internally with a lot of other OHA partners in addition to the title company. And so we have outlined all of this information in the monthly invoicing form. Thank you.
Moving on to the different invoice types. So there are two main invoice types to choose from using this one invoice form. The first invoice type is called the acquisition and closing invoice. So this invoice is to be used for those real property purchases, and typically will be the first invoice form that the organizations will submit for reimbursement from OHA. The biggest differences between the acquisition and closing invoice and the monthly invoice is that the acquisition and closing invoice typically can be expedited based off of purchase agreements. And like Blanca was saying earlier, we do ask for a 30 to 45-day notice. And the acquisition and closing invoice does not need to align to a specific time period or month. You can submit that invoice as soon as you know what your closing costs will be for the real property purchase. The other invoice format is the monthly invoice. Now, this would be the recurring invoice form that the organizations will be submitting for their recurring costs, development costs, and all of the other costs outside of closing on a specific property. So these expenditures should line up with the time frame that you're invoicing for. So for example, if you incur a cost in the month of June, we request that you provide list that cost on the June 2023 invoice form. And again, like Blanca was mentioning earlier, payment terms for the monthly invoice are typically about 45 days after the receipt of a completed invoice form. Moving on to the next slide, we have the payment timelines. And this is just a little high-level view of the timelines for both the acquisition and the closing invoice. And here we can see the acquisition closing invoice. We do ask for 30 to 45 days before closing. And then we do ask that the invoice form itself be sent over to our team at least 15 to 25 days before the date that the closing funds are required. That way our team can work on approving the invoice and coordinating to get payment out by closing date. For the monthly invoice timelines, we do ask that invoice forms for prior month be provided by 15 days for prior month invoices. So for example, a May 2023 invoice we request be sent to us by June 15th. We'll do our reviews, and then typically payment will be sent 45 days after receipt of the completed invoice form. Moving into the form itself. So this next section is going to be walking through the invoice form tab by tab. We do have a couple slides here talking about each of the individual tabs, and then we'll go through a live walkthrough of the file itself together here in a little while. But the first tab is the instructions. So this tab here will have high-level details like your grant program objectives, your eligible program activities, the invoicing process information, as well as all of the specific information that we ask for on each tab, and a description of the type of information that we would be looking for. There are certain fields within this invoice form that are, for example, drop downs or manual entries, and we can go through that later. But moving on to the next slide, so the tab 1 of the invoice form, one thing that you'll see is a common theme throughout this whole file is anything that is in this light blue shade is something that we request you populate with information. So here we have tab 1 of the invoicing form, and we have example organization on section A. And then section B here, we would ask that you provide the totals by budget subcategory. And this would align with your grant agreement. So the totals, for example, for this one is the acquisition and closing invoice. We ask that you provide the totals in the requested costs column, and the documented costs column is a formula that's driven by another tab, which we can go through shortly here. And the next slide is just a continuation of tab 1 to show the budget line items for the startup costs. And this is also, again, listed in the Exhibit D of your grant agreement. Moving on to tab 2, expenditure details. So here we ask that you provide the individual expense for all of the expenses that you're claiming. So for example, if your organization is claiming $2,500 for site improvements / landscaping, we would ask that you provide the line item that adds up to those $2,500. And we provided an example here with the invoice date, company / vendor name, invoice number, the 5024 amount, and the expense notes. We understand that some organizations may have funding from different sources, so we do ask that you provide the amount of the expense that will be coded to the 5024 grant program. And then in the expense notes, if that total amount is different than the amount you're claiming for 5024, we ask that you provide that detail in there as well. And then we do ask that you provide supporting documentation for each of these expense line items as well within your invoice form submission package. And the last tabs, this would be like your certification of authenticity. So all we ask here is that we, an authorized agent of the organization, review the invoice form and certify that everything reported is accurate and complete. And The authorized signer can be the same person preparing the form. It doesn't have to be a different person. All we ask that it is a authorized signer for the organization. Now we'll go ahead and go through the actual live walkthrough. All right, so the invoice form, the instructions tab here, and I'll scroll down a little bit so we can see the additional cells and how it looks. So here, talk about the blue shaded cells that do require input, and everything in gray is either links, formulas, or references, and those do not need to be edited. And if we keep scrolling down, we'll see each tab is broken out by section, the data field, the field type. So there could be a couple different field types, whether it's a manual entry or a drop-down selection, and then instructions on what we would be looking for that specific data field. So we have that for all of the different tabs and sections within this form. We hope this will be useful for your organization when completing this form. If there are any questions on what specifically we're looking for in a data field, the instructions tab will have a little more detail on that specific data field and what we'd be looking for. So moving on to tab 1, here is where we'd request that you provide the organization completing the form. So I'll go ahead and put example organization. We request that you choose a county from here, project name, grant agreement number, and all that information as well. The other thing to note, and I do want to call this out, is we ask that you choose your invoicing period here in this drop-down menu. So if it is your first acquisition or closing invoice, please select that. But if you are using a regular monthly invoice, we do ask that you provide, that you select the appropriate month here. And then for this example, we'll go ahead and just go with acquisition and closing invoice. So moving down to section B, expenditures information. So we have our requested costs, and we ask that this be the total. So since this will be an acquisition or closing invoice, let's just go ahead and say that we're requesting $1 million for building acquisition. Now, the one thing you'll notice is as soon as I put that $1 million in here, documented costs highlighted red. And the reason for that is we're requesting an amount on tab 1 that isn't broken out on tab 2 expenditure details. So on tab 2, I'll go here and then select the specific budget category and the budget subcategory. So since we're requesting reimbursement for building acquisition, we'll go ahead and select that one. Invoice date, we'll go ahead and select today. The vendor, I'll go ahead and say title company, and then invoice, whatever the invoice number is on the closing statement, whether it's a HUD-1 or some different form of documentation. Feel free to put down the invoice number there. This could also be the escrow number as well. And the HB-5024 amount would be the $1 million. And then we would provide the expense notes saying whether this was the purchase of XYZ property or any relevant details there as well. And if we move back to the invoice form, we see that the documented costs here is tying with the requested costs, and there are no highlights red or any error checking or any conditional formatting. So then we would ask that you provide this for all of the expenditures claiming reimbursement for. And then once we're done with that, go back to the certification tab, review all of the numbers here. So these will pull in from tab 1. And then as one last check, we are requesting $1 million of development costs, specifically the building acquisition. And our total invoice form request is for $1 million. We would provide our certification of authenticity here. Date. And then once we complete this, we would save it down, gather the closing statement from the title company or the escrow company, and send that over to the inbox located here for processing. So we do ask that you provide the supporting documentation as well as this form in that email package, just so that we can quickly review and get payments out as soon as possible. And now I'll hand it over to Angel for some closing items.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this instructional webinar on the invoicing process for your 5024 grant funds. We would like to know if you have further questions after this TA session, and if you do, you are more than welcome to reach out to the SDOH 5024 team's shared inbox. The address is here at the bottom of the slide. And we look forward to working with all of you. Thanks again.